He came down from the mountains, not with commandments, but with questions, not to save the world, but to challenge it. And his name was Zarathustra. But this prophet was not born of ancient myth. He was conjured by a man who walked alone in the Alps, plagued by migraines, solitude, and visions. A man who believed that in an age where the old gods had grown silent, humanity would need a new voice, one not of obedience, but of becoming. His name was Friedrich Nietzsche, a philosopher, a poet, a man often misunderstood by both critics and admirers. It was in the silence of snow-covered trails and sunlit ridges that Nietzsche imagined Thus Spoke Zarathustra, his most mysterious, lyrical, and prophetic work. But what inspired this strange book, half parable, half revelation? Why did he choose an ancient name, Zarathustra, to deliver a message meant not for his time, but perhaps for ours? In this journey, we'll explore the world behind the words, the solitude that gave birth to vision, the ideas that shook the foundation of belief, and the voice Nietzsche crafted to echo through centuries. Was Zarathustra a prophecy of things to come, or a reflection of a man who saw too deeply, too soon? In the late 1870s, Friedrich Nietzsche vanished from the lecture halls of Basel and retreated into silence. His health was crumbling, crippling migraines, near blindness, digestive pain that kept him awake at night. But something deeper was unraveling too. He had grown disillusioned with the world he once thought he belonged to: academia, religion, nationalism. It was as if every institution he had trusted began to feel like a cage. By age 35, Nietzsche had resigned from his university post. Unmarried, estranged from many of his former colleagues, and increasingly solitary, he began living a life that many at the time saw as eccentric, wandering from village to village across Italy, France, and above all, Switzerland. But this solitude was not retreat, it was preparation. In a remote village called Sils Maria, nestled high in the Alps, Nietzsche found something rare, silence so complete it sharpened the mind. He called these mountains his holy place, and it was here in the summer of 1881 that an idea struck him with such force he claimed it changed him forever. He had conceived a vision, a figure, a voice, and that voice would become Zarathustra. But before he could write, Nietzsche had to unwrite the world he came from. He had once admired Richard Wagner, the great composer, but grew disillusioned by what he saw as Wagner's nationalism and theatrical Christianity. He had once hoped science would replace superstition, but began to fear it offered facts without meaning. This was a time of enormous transition in Europe. Faith in religion was waning. Industrial progress was reshaping cities and souls. Philosophers debated whether morality was universal or invented. Nietzsche stepped into this turbulence with no school, no followers, only a journal, a pen, and the belief that modern life had lost its center. He didn't write as a preacher or a politician. He wrote like a man on the edge of revelation. Thus Spoke Zarathustra was born not in comfort or acclaim, but in exile. He once wrote, "The desert grows, woe to him who hides the desert within." These weren't just metaphors. They were reflections of a man who had stared into the emptiness of a collapsing moral world and dared to imagine something new. Nietzsche's isolation wasn't a tragedy. It became his forge, a place where solitude refined his thought. In the stillness of Sils Maria, the question emerged that would haunt all his later work: if we are truly free from old gods and old truths, what now calls us forward? Zarathustra was Nietzsche's answer, a poetic voice that wandered down from the mountains, not to command, but to awaken. When Nietzsche gave voice to Zarathustra, he wasn't just inventing a character, he was resurrecting a forgotten figure from ancient Persia. The historical Zarathustra, also known as Zoroaster, was one of the first recorded religious prophets, a man who preached a world divided between light and darkness, truth and lies. But Nietzsche's Zarathustra speaks a very different gospel. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche transforms this ancient prophet into a new kind of teacher, one who climbs down from the mountain not with answers, but with riddles. Perhaps his most famous and misunderstood proclamation is this: God is dead. He wrote in strong terms, not to mock religion, but to describe a cultural reality he believed had already taken place. For Nietzsche, this was not an attack on faith, but a reflection of shifting belief systems. The old religious certainties, heaven, divine morality, eternal purpose, had lost their grip on modern life. Science was rising, dogma was retreating, and yet nothing new had taken its place. The danger, he warned, was not in the loss of faith, but in the emptiness that followed. Without something to guide us, he feared, people might drift toward nihilism, the belief that life has no meaning, no value, no direction. But Nietzsche wasn't offering despair. He was offering a challenge. In Zarathustra, he introduces the figure of the Übermensch, often translated as overman or beyond man. This is not a ruler, not a tyrant, not a perfect human. The Übermensch is an ideal, someone who creates their own values, who lives not by inherited truths but by their own vision of life. The overman does not ask, "What should I do?" but rather, "What can I become?" It is a call to self-overcoming, to transform suffering into strength and doubt into creation. Then comes one of Nietzsche's most haunting thought experiments, eternal recurrence. Imagine this, he asks. What if you had to live this exact life, again and again, forever? Every joy, every mistake, every heartbreak, on repeat. Would you curse it or embrace it? This is not a scientific theory, it's a moral test. If you would not will your life to repeat, perhaps you are not living it fully. The eternal recurrence is a mirror, forcing us to ask, are we living in a way we could truly affirm? Zarathustra also criticizes what Nietzsche calls herd morality, the tendency of people to follow collective norms without question. He wrote in strong language about how societies often reward obedience over excellence, comfort over courage. But Nietzsche was not calling for cruelty. He was asking, what happens to the spirit when it no longer strives? In his eyes, too much safety dulls the soul. To grow, he believed, one must be willing to stand apart, to risk misunderstanding, isolation, and even failure. Thus, Spoke Zarathustra is not an instruction manual. It's a poetic journey, a dialogue between doubt and transformation. Some found it incomprehensible, others intoxicating. But perhaps that was Nietzsche's point. Wisdom cannot be given. It must be earned. What made these ideas so controversial in Nietzsche's time, and what they still reveal about ours? When Nietzsche wrote Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he wasn't trying to predict the future. But in many ways, he did. He sensed something stirring in the soul of modern Europe, a quiet unraveling beneath all the progress and pride. And now, over a century later, many of his questions still echo in our lives. We live in an age of connection, yet millions feel deeply alone. We have access to endless information, but meaning feels harder to grasp. Nietzsche saw this disorientation coming. He warned that when traditional foundations, like religion, morality, or even shared culture, begin to dissolve, people often reach for replacements that offer comfort, not truth. Nietzsche called this spiritual void nihilism, not a philosophy but a condition, not believing in nothing but feeling as though nothing truly matters. He believed the 20th century, and beyond, would be marked by this crisis. And indeed, the wars, ideologies, and existential movements that followed often bore the mark of a world struggling to rediscover meaning. Today, nihilism doesn't always look like despair. Sometimes it looks like endless scrolling, like numbing routines, like ambition without a destination. But Nietzsche didn't leave us in the dark. Through Zarathustra, he offered not a solution but a challenge. Become who you are, he wrote, not who you were told to be, not who others expect, but the self forged through choice, struggle, and creation. In an age of algorithmic lives and curated identities, Nietzsche's call to self-overcoming feels more urgent than ever. He asks us to live deliberately, not by following but by questioning, not by seeking comfort but by choosing purpose. The Übermensch, or overman, is often misunderstood, especially in political misreadings Nietzsche never endorsed. It was never meant as a blueprint for domination, but as a symbol of personal transformation. He wrote in strong terms to provoke reflection, not to prescribe dogma. The real overman, as Nietzsche imagined, may be quiet, patient, joyful even in suffering, because they have learned to dance with it. In this sense, the Übermensch is not someone above others, but someone beyond their former self. And then there is Nietzsche's most haunting question: would you live this life again, exactly as it is? In a world obsessed with progress and escape, eternal recurrence reminds us to ask, are we living in a way we could affirm, not just once, but forever? This isn't about literal eternity, it's a metaphor, a moral test. What would we change if we knew we had to live it all again? What would we keep and cherish? But for all its beauty and depth, Nietzsche's vision wasn't universally embraced. Some saw Zarathustra as too poetic to be philosophy, too personal to be doctrine. Others feared what a world without absolute values might invite. And yet, the questions remain. As relevant now as they were then, in our search for meaning, perhaps Zarathustra is still walking beside us, quietly asking, "Are you becoming what only you can become?" Few thinkers have been praised as deeply and misunderstood as often as Friedrich Nietzsche. In his lifetime, his work was largely ignored. He died in obscurity, his later years marked by profound illness, with his writings left scattered and controversial. And yet, in the decades that followed, his voice grew louder. Nietzsche's language was poetic, provocative, sometimes deliberately elusive. He didn't write for easy agreement, he wrote to stir something. But that very force made his work vulnerable to misreading. Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, often translated as overman or beyond man, was not a call to domination. Yet, in the early 20th century, it was co-opted by fascist ideologies, not because Nietzsche supported them, but because his work was reinterpreted, sometimes selectively quoted, and heavily edited after his death. A misuse Nietzsche himself would have condemned, a distortion now widely discredited by scholars. He opposed anti-Semitism, nationalism, and herd mentality. Yet, ironically, he became a symbol for all three, through interpretations he never endorsed. This tragic irony has shadowed Nietzsche's legacy ever since. Scholars have spent decades disentangling his true voice from the voices that claimed him. Some critics argue that Nietzsche's poetic style undermines his philosophical clarity. Thus Spoke Zarathustra reads like scripture, not system. It asks, it provokes, but rarely concludes. For some, this is maddening. For others, it's exactly the point. He didn't aim to give answers, but to teach us how to live with questions. To many modern readers, this makes his work deeply relevant. But it also means every interpretation must tread carefully. Nietzsche's legacy is not one of fixed conclusions, but of open doors. He invites us not to worship his ideas, but to wrestle with them. To misunderstand Nietzsche is easy. To outgrow the need to agree or disagree with him, that may be closer to his true spirit. His voice endures, not as a doctrine, but as a provocation. Not because he told us what to think, but because he dared us to begin. At the start of our journey, we asked, what vision stirred Nietzsche to speak through the voice of a prophet? What truth was he reaching for beneath the poetry and the thunder? Now, perhaps, we see more clearly. Thus Spoke Zarathustra was not meant to convert, but to awaken. Not to preach a final truth, but to prepare the soul for uncertainty. In a world that felt increasingly hollow, Nietzsche dared to imagine a rebirth, not of old gods, but of inner strength. Nietzsche didn't offer easy comfort, but an honest confrontation, a mirror, held up not to flatter but to provoke. And yet, the questions he raised remain alive today. Can we live without absolute meaning and still live meaningfully? Can we create values, not inherit them, and still stand firm in the storm? Nietzsche didn't claim to know the answers. He only knew that we must walk the path ourselves, that each age would need its own Zarathustra, its own reckoning with the abyss and its own call to rise again. The vision that spoke through Nietzsche has never truly died. It lingers like a distant voice across the mountains, not demanding to be followed, but daring us to listen. And the question it leaves us with is simple. What will you do with your freedom?